Captain James Mitchell stood in the weapons storage area at Nui Dat in April 1968 and observed something that struck him as unusual enough to warrant investigation. An Australian sniper named Sergeant William Torrance was examining an American M14 rifle with an expression that suggested something between amusement and disbelief. Mitchell, who was familiar with various rifle systems, approached Torrance to inquire about the examination. "Something wrong with the M14?" Mitchell asked. Torrance looked up from the rifle. "This weapon is massive. The Americans claim this is a standard rifle. By Australian standards, this weapon is enormous." Mitchell was somewhat surprised by this assessment. The M14 was a standard American military rifle. It was not particularly large by American standards. But Mitchell recognized that Torrance was comparing the M14 to Australian rifles with which Torrance was familiar. "What rifle do you normally use?" Mitchell asked. Torrance gestured toward his own rifle. "The L1A1, British design, lighter, more balanced, less massive. This American weapon feels like carrying a piece of artillery." Mitchell examined the two rifles side by side. The M14 was larger and heavier than the L1A1. The difference was visible, but not dramatic from Mitchell's perspective. But Torrance's assessment that the M14 was massive prompted a conversation among other soldiers who were present in the weapons storage area. One American soldier, Sergeant Robert Lewis, challenged Torrance's assessment. "The M14 is not massive. It is a standard rifle. You are exaggerating the size." Torrance looked at Lewis with an expression that suggested confidence in his assessment. "The M14 is massive compared to the L1A1. That is not exaggeration. That is observation." Lewis was not satisfied with this response. A bet was proposed. Lewis would bet that the M14 was not as massive as Torrance claimed. Torrance would bet that the M14 was indeed massive. The specific terms of the bet were that if an independent observer agreed with Torrance that the M14 was massive, Torrance would win. If an independent observer agreed with Lewis that the M14 was not massive, Lewis would win. Captain Mitchell was chosen as the independent observer. Mitchell examined both rifles carefully. The M14 weighed approximately 8.59 pounds. The L1A1 weighed approximately 9.43 pounds. So, by weight, the L1A1 was actually heavier. But the M14 was longer than the L1A1. The M14 was also bulkier and less balanced. From a handling perspective, the M14 could be perceived as more massive, even though it was slightly lighter. Mitchell rendered a judgment that was somewhat nuanced. The M14 is heavier than the L1A1 by weight measurement, but the M14 is bulkier and less balanced. From a handling perspective, the M14 could reasonably be described as more massive. This judgment essentially gave the bet to Torrance. Lewis was not satisfied. "You are saying the weapon is massive based on how it feels, not based on actual measurements," Lewis argued. "That is not a legitimate basis for the bet." Torrance was amused by Lewis's objection. "Weapon assessment is based on how a weapon performs in the field. How a weapon feels matters. Handling characteristics matter. The M14 is massive." The bet was ultimately resolved in Torrance's favor, although the resolution was somewhat ambiguous because the judgment was based on subjective handling characteristics rather than on objective measurements. But the bet had created an amusing situation that spread through the military personnel at Nui Dat. The story of the American soldier who had argued that the M14 was not massive, while an Australian sniper insisted that it was massive, became a topic of humor and conversation. Over the following weeks, the incident became increasingly legendary. The story was retold and elaborated. Exaggerations were added. By the time the incident had been repeated multiple times, the story had taken on elements that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. In one version of the story,
Torrance had claimed that the M14 was so massive that it should be classified as a light machine gun rather than as a rifle. In another version, Lewis had bet that an American soldier could shoot the M14 accurately from the hip without support.
The actual incident, which had been a relatively straightforward comparison of rifle characteristics, had become a humorous legend about the difference between American and Australian perceptions of weapons. By June 1968, the story of the sizing bet between Lewis and Torrance had become part of military folklore at Nui Dat. The story was told and retold with variations and elaborations. The story had become more amusing with each retelling. The significance of the story extended beyond the humor. The story revealed something about how Australian and American soldiers perceived military equipment differently. Australian soldiers, trained with British and Australian weapon systems, perceived American weapons with fresh eyes. American soldiers, trained with American weapons, perceived American weapons as normal and appropriate. This difference in perspective created humor and also created learning opportunities. Australian soldiers brought fresh perspectives on American equipment. American soldiers learned from those fresh perspectives that equipment they perceived as normal might be perceived differently by soldiers trained with different equipment. By 1969, as the Australian military presence in Vietnam was winding down, the story of the sizing bet had become one of the more frequently told stories about interactions between American and Australian soldiers. The story was not about a major military issue. The story was not about tactics or doctrine or military effectiveness. The story was simply about a disagreement about whether an American rifle should be described as massive. But the story was memorable and amusing. The story revealed something about how different military cultures perceived the same equipment differently. When Torrance rotated out of Vietnam in 1968, he carried with him the reputation of being the Australian sniper who had argued that the American M14 was massive. The reputation followed Torrance throughout his remaining military service. By the time Torrance retired from the Australian military in 1985, the story of the sizing bet had become part of military lore that multiple soldiers could recount. Robert Lewis, the American sergeant who had been on the losing side of the bet, remained in the military for another 5 years after the incident. Lewis would occasionally tell the story of the sizing bet and would express his continued disagreement with Torrance's assessment that the M14 was massive. By the year 2000, the story of the sizing bet had become a historical curiosity. The incident was mentioned in some accounts of American-Australian interactions in Vietnam. The incident was cited as an example of how different military cultures perceived equipment differently. Military historians found the incident amusing and somewhat trivial compared to more significant aspects of American-Australian military interactions. But the incident also revealed something important about how different training backgrounds and different equipment systems influenced how military personnel perceived military equipment. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after the incident had occurred, the story of the sizing bet remained part of military folklore. The story was told by veteran soldiers who had been present at Nui Dat during 1968. The story was recounted in memoirs and in oral histories. The story had achieved a kind of immortality, not because of its military significance, but because of its humor and because of what it revealed about interactions between American and Australian military personnel. The slouch hat represented Australian military effectiveness. The sizing bet about the M14 rifle represented something different. It represented the humor and the human interactions that occurred between American and Australian soldiers who were working together in Vietnam. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military in Vietnam. The slouch hat influenced military doctrine and military strategy. The sizing bet influenced nothing except to create humor and to reveal how different military cultures perceived equipment differently. but both represented the Australian presence in Vietnam.
Both represented the interactions between American and Australian military personnel.
One Australian officer, when interviewed decades later about interactions between American and Australian soldiers, mentioned the sizing bet story. "We found the American equipment massive compared to what we were used to," the officer said. The M14 was bulkier than the L1A1. The M16, when it arrived later, seemed even more massive. "We were not criticizing American equipment. We were simply observing that it was different from what we were accustomed to." The sizing bet story captured that observation in a humorous way. This reflection captured the significance of the sizing bet story. The story had represented genuine differences in equipment perception between American and Australian soldiers. The differences were real. The story had simply captured those differences in a humorous and memorable way. By the year 2025, the sizing bet story had become part of military history and part of military folklore. The story remained a reminder that interactions between military personnel from different nations involved not just exchange of doctrine and methodology, but also humor and recognition of how different training backgrounds influenced perception of the same equipment. The slouch hat had become an icon of Australian military culture. The sizing bet had become a story of humor and human interaction between American and Australian soldiers. Both had contributed to the broader Australian presence in Vietnam and to how American military personnel understood that presence.